Hiya, it's Liam here, and if you like what we do at the podcast, please do consider supporting us from just £1. And if you love the show, from just £3 a month, you get early access on all of our content as well. All the details are in the show notes. This week, as JD Vance prepares to follow Donald Trump into the White House for the next 4 years, I want to shine a light on the most high profile understudy in the world. The Vice Presidency is often criticised and ridiculed by many, including those who have held the office. But how much power do they really wield? In this episode, I ask, what does the Vice President actually do? Welcome to America, a history podcast. I'm Liam Heffernan, and every week we answer a different question to understand the people, the places, and the events that make the USA what it is today. To discuss this, I am joined by a US politics lecturer from University College Cork and host of the excellent podcast A Chicken in Every Pot, which we'll link to in the show notes. Her monograph, co-authored with Alex Waddan, entitled Obama v Trump, The Politics of Presidential Legacy and Rollback, is available right now. And the follow-up, Trump v Biden, is due for publication in 2025. Welcome to the show, Clodagh Harrington.
Thank you very much. Pleasure to be here.
Yeah, I mean, your voice may be familiar to some because you joined us in the run-up to the election for an In the Making episode. And, I mean, yeah, things have changed since, right?
Yeah, seems like quite some time ago. This could have been a very different conversation. It could have been one where we talked about, a lot of firsts. Obviously, that's not how it rolls, and that's democracy for you. But I still think, the vice presidency is... It's really worth attention and note and conversation. And, historically, it hasn't been held in the highest regard, let's put it that way. And not least by individuals who've actually held the office themselves, which I always think is particularly amusing. But yeah, it's a really, really important role.
Yeah, and it's funny, isn't it, when you talk about that, because Joe Biden himself, when he was Veep to Obama, the memes that dominated Twitter and social media at the time of like Joe being this sort of slightly bumbly kind of assistant to Obama, and yet he managed to shake that off and win the presidency still. So there's something in that, I guess.
Oh, absolutely. And I mean, it's probably, it would be simplistic to say that, everybody who enters as a vice president wants and would end up as a president. Of course, we know that doesn't always happen, and that it's not even always desirable. But certainly, when you're in there, you've got the kind of the ultimate insider take on things. I think for me, and this is just a kind of a broad observation, because obviously there's plenty of ways in which you could contradict it, but it does seem to me that there are kind of two different characters, like the character of somebody who would want to be president and the character of somebody who would want to be vice president. It's not necessarily the same. To me, like it's a bit Ronald Reagan and George H.W. Bush. One is so obviously the shining star, and the other is more the kind of the, solid, reliable, dependent, consistent guy who isn't necessarily shining star material. So you have all of these kind of interesting dynamics. And then, of course, the other side of it is that the second in command is just bursting to get in there, by any means necessary.
Yeah, it's an interesting dynamic, isn't it? And one that's been almost mythicized and blown out of proportion and caricatured throughout, popular media over the years. So, I guess let's bring it back to basics for a second. What's the official job description of the vice president?
Okay, so you see in the literature, with the kind of the shorthand for the president is POTUS, as most people will know, and in the vice president's case, it's V POTUS, and there, it's the highest, or it's the second highest ranking office in the executive branch. So that's pretty phenomenal kudos in itself, in terms of what they do. Just a couple of sentences on the kind of the origins, I suppose, might be useful. Back in the day, I think back in sort of, Philadelphia in 1787, when they were trying to work out, what was the best course of action and how do you sort of successfully manage the separation of powers, all of this kind of thing. it seems that the founders kind of saw two purposes, if you like, for what the vice president might do and be. The first one is the one that everybody knows. It's the caricature one of being the heartbeat away from perhaps the job that you actually want. So there's that. And historically, I think it would literally have been that, because, if you came second, if you like, in the race, then, you got the vice president's job, which to me is sort of like the worst of all worlds, because you really are going to be waiting to have your heartbeat moment and step up to the main post. So that's one part of it. And then the second part of it, which is perhaps less dramatic, but more exciting, more satisfying, I suppose, is how I might put it, is that the vice president would serve as the Senate's presiding officer. So he or she is the vice president. The vice president is the president of the Senate. So that is something that has been very important and consequential, obviously, perhaps more so in some administrations than other. But they're the two kind of hats that the vice president would wear. And I suppose then the other thing, and we see this played out to varying extents in modern times anyway, the role of the vice president will be shaped perhaps a bit to their strengths, depending on what they might actually be.
Yeah, and actually, I think it's important to just clarify the importance of their role in the Senate, as you pointed out, because if I'm not mistaken, when the Senate is quite closely divided between the two parties, the vice president has an enormous amount of power there, because they're the deciding vote when anything is tied, right?
That's right. So they literally have they can cast the deciding vote in the chamber, and that's a massively significant responsibility. I mean, I think that there are two. I think the two presidents that have had the most tie-breaking votes, actually both just by coincidence the same amount. I mean, John Calhoun back in the day, he's not exactly my specialist subject, but I do know that he cast 31 tie-breaking votes during his time in the Senate back in the late 1820s. And then also, by sort of interesting coincidence, Kamala Harris, as of this month, I mean, I didn't actually look this morning, but as of this month, she's also had 31 tie-breaking votes in the Senate. So these can be things like it might be approval of an executive appointment or a judicial appointment, or then, of course, the more kind of conventional legislative stuff as well. So that can really, these can be literally make or break votes. So that is maybe something that can be a little bit forgotten or overlooked sometimes, in terms of, you think about, John Adams or whatever saying, oh, it's the most insignificant office that ever the invention of man contrived, or whatever that famous phrase is. But when you think about it, they do actually have quite a lot of influence. So that's, worth noting, I think.
But this is kind of the problem, because as you mentioned, John Adams famously kind of derided the office of the vice presidency, an office which he held himself, and an office in which he benefited from having, because arguably he wasn't the most charismatic chap, and he potentially might not have been able to win the presidency had he not had the kind of endorsement of Washington. So it's people who have held the office, who have that sort of influence, saying those things, that does bring the vice presidency into sort of a bit of disrepute and kind of destroys its credibility, doesn't it?
Well, I think historically, yes, definitely. No, I do think it's changed. I would, make that point very clearly. I mean, historically, one of my favorite, derogatory quotes from the man in the job, there are many, but Woodrow Wilson's vice president, Thomas R. Marshall, he was, speaking back it was either in the teens or the 1920s. He said the vice presidency is like a man in a cataleptic fit. That's like catatonic, I think. He cannot speak. He cannot move. He suffers no pain. He is perfectly conscious of all that goes on, but he has no part in it. And that's whenever I teach this subject to my students, we start with that, and it's like, okay, so who would want this job? It's almost comically unattractive, because you're so near everything that you want, but you are like, there's a kind of a glass wall between you and it, if you like. Now, that said, I mean, it has evolved, I think, like I said, enormously over time. I think the other way perhaps in which those that have held the office show contempt, not just through their words, as you know, there are many examples we could go to, but there's been, like, for example, a couple of others where when they have stood up, like I'm thinking of Truman perhaps in particular, like when he stood up in, you know, in kind of quite dramatic circumstances when FDR actually died. I mean, he had been vice president, he steps up to be the president, and he leaves the position vacant for a while. I mean, I think Gerald Ford did the same thing for a temporary period. And I mean, to me, that just shows how mindful they were of the fact that it didn't matter if the post was empty. So words and deeds, I think, historically have shown the kind of the disregard that the actual incumbent has felt for it.
Yeah, and that's interesting, that, because you're right. If it was seen as a critical position, or at least if there was some sort of day-to-day urgency in the role itself, then there would be more urgency in filling it. And it kind of brings into question what the role of the vice president actually serves. And there is an element there that really, they're kind of a campaign tool, right? They balance the ticket, and they're there to help someone get elected in the first instance. I mean, is that all they're becoming useful for now?
I want to say no. I mean, the thing that, now that you've said that, I'm just so strongly reminded of, you know, always on the campaign trail, you know, you always have, you know, it was the Biden-Harris ticket, or the Trump-Vance ticket, or the Bush-Gore, or sorry, you know, Bush-Cheney, or whatever it might be, ticket. You know, it's all the hyphenated duo through the campaign. And then once they're in office, it's like, you don't hear so much about the other person anymore. But I don't want to dismiss A, the role, and B, the actions, because I think in the modern era, and I would say, like, maybe particularly since the 70s, I mean, I think it started changing maybe even a bit earlier than that. You know, the individuals that had to step up under dramatic circumstances. So that would be, for example, Harry Truman and also Lyndon Johnson. I think because they had that experience of going from being the guy in the back room, not being invited to the important meetings and being in the loop, if you like, they understood the importance then of, if you are going to have a vice president and you are going to bother having that other person in the other office just waiting, you may as well bring them into the fold to some extent. So they did start setting, you know, the groundwork, and I think that's really important. And then maybe probably the 1970s is when there was a real effort at, I don't want to say parity, that's probably like an overstatement, but something along the lines of more of a partner than an add-on.
Yeah, and actually, it's worth noting that of the 45 unique individuals who have been the president, 15 of those, so a third of those, were formerly vice presidents. So I guess it's not an insignificant office when you look at its ability to equip someone with the profile, the credentials, the experience to then take on the top job. But I think what's also really interesting is, of those 15, 9 of those assumed office because of death or resignation of the sitting president. So that's a high ratio of presidents, you know, who have died or left office. So we should be taking this VP pick a lot more seriously, surely.
Yeah, I think so. And I mean, you know, not least when the incumbent president or running mate, as it might be, is older, as they tend to be, as they, you know, they are at the moment. So there's that. And I mean, I suppose the other thing that I think is really quite fascinating about this is the idea that so if, you know, the vice president steps in if the president is ill or is deemed to be unfit or unwell, or obviously dies, of course. And I mean, you have these kind of interesting moments of, you know, let's say something really unglamorous and unstatesmanlike, like a colonoscopy, right? You know, they have to go under, I mean, we don't want to think too much about this, but, you know, they have to go under general anesthetic. So for that duration, they can't be in charge because they're not conscious. So you have, I think Dick Cheney stepped in for George W. Bush in that particular instance. Then other times when I think it would have been when Ronald Reagan was shot or there was the assassination attempt, thankfully didn't kill him, during his first term. And he was rushed to hospital. And, there was that kind of classic thing where he was lying, asking the surgeon, were they a Republican or a Democrat or whatever, humor under duress, as always. But it was decided at that point that he wouldn't hand over to his vice president because it would look like this is the height of the Cold War, or that it would look weak. It would make the country look weak, even if it was only for a very brief period. That idea of power waning from the main man, and it is still a man, as we know, it's a very, very kind of significant and consequential thing, even if it's only kind of about perception. So there's that to contend with. And I guess the other thing in relation to the 25th Amendment is the idea that, if the president is no longer deemed fit for office. Now, that's a bit of a tricky decision to ever be making. And I mean, it has been, there's been, I don't know, examples again back to Reagan, I suppose, where, by term 2, and I think perhaps his cognitive faculties were not what they had been previously. And those close to him could see that he was beginning to deteriorate. I'm sure, in terms of his kind of public performances, he was still great, but there was a real concern about his cognitive decline. Now, to be the person or the people to start that conversation, that's a dangerous thing, because if it backfires on you, then, you were going to be out of that circle pretty quickly. So that's a really, I think, fascinating and almost timeless aspect of when somebody decides that the guy in charge is no longer up to the job, who's going to actually see that through, So, and I'm just sort of speculating, I suppose, because Donald Trump is older, and he obviously seems still very fit and capable, but he is not a spring chicken going into his second term in office.
Yeah, and actually, it's no secret that on this show, I think we lean a bit more to the left. So I'm going to acknowledge that bias before I say what I'm about to say. But, Trump has been quite openly vindictive in the past, and he's suggested that he's going to go after his enemies now that he's been re-elected as president. He can do so now with the added almost monarchic protection of sort of immunity from the Supreme Court. Exactly how that's going to play out is anyone's guess, of course. But does that make the vice president quite a dangerous role to have now, especially if you're working for someone like Donald Trump? If you start saying the wrong things, if you start doing the wrong things and getting on the wrong side of him, you know too much to be safe as someone who doesn't necessarily get on with the main man, right?
Yeah, I think that's going to be a really interesting dynamic to watch. I mean, obviously, it is pure speculation at this point because we don't know how things are going to roll out. There was a lot of, kind of amusing punditry back in the summer around the choice of Vance, that how long would that bromance last kind of thing? Would Vance be able to kind of stay in Trump's good books long enough to make it all work? So there were certainly those things to contend with. And I suppose, I mean, again, just kind of thinking about it maybe a bit more historically, you have there have been times when the vice president has seemed almost like a bigger character than the president. And that's a really tricky dynamic as well to manage, because if you're supposed to be the second in command, and if you look like you're the one calling the shots or making the decisions, I think that is that could be kind of confusing or possibly unnerving for voters and those in the echelons of power as well. But I've always been really fascinated by what seemed to be the relationship between George W. Bush and Dick Cheney. That there was this sense that, for any and all big decisions, that Bush's kind of default question was, what does Dick think? Now, there's nothing wrong in having, respect for a second opinion from an insider who's been in Washington forever, all of that kind of stuff. But the idea that one might be deferential to the point of actually the vice president perhaps running the show more than they should, that's also problematic. So it's about, I suppose my point is that it's about trying to get that power dynamic to be as level and as constructive and kind of honest as possible. And it doesn't always happen. I mean, it remains to be seen with Trump and Vance. The duo that always struck me that seemed to be really well balanced were Bill Clinton and Al Gore. That just seemed to me like they were, obviously it got tricky later on because of Clinton's own activities, but just as two guys who were so into what they were doing and so committed and seemed to really bounce off each other intellectually, that seemed like a great pairing to me.
Yeah, but there is an interesting sort of power dynamic there, as you say, and there's almost power plays by the president at times, and I think that's sort of satirized a bit in the TV show Veep, where Julia Louis-Dreyfus, she wants to get this big sort of thing through in the first season, and the president sort of knows that she's ruffling a few feathers and gives her obesity as this big project to work on. And is there this sort of sense that actually in real life as well, the vice president does kind of get handed these sort of Mickey Mouse projects that the president doesn't really have the time or enthusiasm to deal with?
Well, yeah, I mean, that Veep series was just an absolute classic. I remember her strapline for obesity management was put the cupcake down. That was it. That was her brief. So, I mean, yes, there are real world kind of parallels with that to some extent. But, I mean, I think, it goes back a bit to the kind of the relationship between the two. I'm thinking about, like, when Al Gore came in, and to me, and I suppose it was because it was like, kind of coming up to the millennium, and it was the whole IT revolution. It was a very kind of exciting time. And he seemed to be in charge of all the interesting, fun, dynamic stuff, like the tech revolution, the space program, all of these kinds of things that just seemed like the future. And that to me was, from what I had been kind of noting, like quite a departure from what had come before in terms of them presenting as partners, if you like, rather than just being fobbed off with, the stuff that the president didn't want. Now, that said, if you think about the brief that, or some of the brief anyway, that Harris got from Biden, I mean, she got a couple of tricky portfolios for sure. I mean, the immigration on the southern border and trying to have a bit of a long-term set of solutions for what was going on below the border in Latin America. I mean, I don't know how anyone could have come up with anything meaningful in a relatively short space of time that was politically acceptable, etc. for that. So she was given no favors in that regard. But it's not always the case, I don't think.
I mean, cynics would maybe argue that there was something very strategic about Biden giving Harris that portfolio because it was a very tricky one to deliver, as it transpired. And actually, for him, he kind of then has this opportunity, if it goes horrifically wrong, to say, well, I trusted my vice president and she let you down. And then you've got this opportunity to figure out how that plays out going forward. But it's almost a way for him to not have to take full responsibility for it if it goes wrong, right?
Well, I mean, there's a convenience in being seen to hand somebody else the brief, certainly. I mean, there are times when, I mean, the other time that springs to mind, and this isn't actually the vice presidency, but I'm thinking of, when Hillary Clinton as First Lady was handed the brief of healthcare, and had that gone right, or had that worked out differently, she would have been lauded and applauded, and it would have been a massive kind of string to her bow just before she steps into her own independent political career. As it happened, it crashed and burned, as we know. But just this idea of somebody being given, a pretty substantial, tricky and challenging brief, and rather it goes to plan or not. I mean, I don't know enough about the kind of the intricacies of the southern border remit, but certainly it seems unlikely that was ever going to go well for Harris, to be honest.
And of course, that ended up plaguing her a little bit when she was running for office herself. But I just want to come back to, because you mentioned Hillary Clinton as a first lady, and I think that there is this really interesting tangential power dynamic in the White House between the First Lady and the Vice President, because both have the president's ear, one in a more formal political capacity and one in a more personal capacity. But those lines historically blur quite a bit, don't they? And is there this undermining of the vice president here when you have quite a strong-willed or opinionated first lady?
I suppose there is the potential for that. I guess she's going to come up against, depending on who it is and who the individuals are. But there's always going to be some scope for that. I mean, I know just off the top of my head, thinking about, when Joe Biden decided that Kamala Harris would be his running mate, I think Jill wasn't overjoyed because, Harris had been, on the attack with Biden back in the previous incarnation when they were both running for the post. And obviously, first ladies tend to be, generally speaking, they tend to be very protective of their husbands, as is perfectly understandable. So, I mean, there was a famous line from Jill Biden. She said, there are millions of people in America. Why do we have to choose someone who attacked Joe? So, like, she was really holding on to, something that came from one of those televised debates back in, 2019 or whatever. So that wasn't helpful. Now, that did seem to all smooth out. That was okay. But I think where the First Lady is going to clash is when they're a kind of a Nancy Reagan type, a Jill Biden type, like somebody who's fiercely loyal to her husband, and where you can see that their marriages are really genuine, and that kind of almost watchdog kind of role that the First Lady has is coming from a place of real authenticity. If you think about somebody like Melania Trump, for example, like that's a very different experience in terms of hands off. I mean, the extent to which she has her husband's ear, I mean, perhaps to some extent, but you can see what a different dynamic it is rather than, the couples who really present genuinely as being in a loving marriage. That would be the Obamas, the Reagans, the Bidens, you can tell. And I think then that can be sometimes if the First Lady thinks that her husband is being exploited, overworked, undermined, disrespected, any of those things, then they will jump in for sure.
Yeah, but it's interesting though, isn't it? Because the First Lady, you're right. Like, I mean, figures like Melania Trump, she's really kind of redefining that role a little bit compared to her recent comparables. But I think First Ladies generally have a little bit more autonomy, right? Because they can talk to the president. I say 24/7. I mean, they're busy people, but it's a lot easier to suggest things and have slightly more open conversations at the dinner table.
Of course, yeah.
When the eyes of the world aren't watching, and that can be very influential in terms of what the president then decides to do. And there's a crossover there because in theory that's what the vice president is for, right? But you can't help the First Lady and hopefully in future the first man from having that sort of influence over their spouse.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And I'd say where the other clash as well would be, and this is probably a podcast for a different day, but the dynamics with the chief of staff, because that's such a powerful, influential, personal role and arguably closer to the president than the vice president would actually be in terms of kind of remit and all the rest of it. So that's a very interesting set of interactions as well. So like, I remember one of Obama's staffers saying this years ago, and I mean, it's true for all of them, but they just said it very succinctly. They said, the thing that people want more than anything with the president is FaceTime. If you get 5 minutes with the president, you're doing very well. Obviously, if you're the head of an important state or whatever, you get more. But generally speaking, like, their day is just divided up into the tiniest blocks of FaceTime with whoever. And so that thing of, the First Lady not having to schedule the time. And the same, like if they have children, that they are the ones that get the soft time, if you like, and the soft unscripted interactions. And those are priceless and powerful things. So it really, I guess the takeaway is, it's really helpful if they have a strong marriage because it's a lonely, difficult, stressful, demanding, solitary job. And if you do have somebody that you can have a hug with at the end of the day, I think that's absolutely crucial.
Absolutely. But I think for me, the overlap between sort of the First Lady and, I guess the political sphere is apparent in Michelle Obama because there was a point in 2024 when Biden dropped out and Michelle Obama almost had to justify why she didn't want to run for the candidacy, because she was such an influential public figure, and she became such a key person for Barack Obama, that there's almost an expectation now that of course she'll want to run for president one day. And it just kind of highlights this total blurring of the lines between First Lady and political office now.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that there would have been an awful lot of people who would have been overjoyed and relieved had she run. Now, she'd have had all the haters as well. It's not to pretend that it would have been a smooth ride. But I mean, I think she did say very clearly previously that she was never going to run after, her time in the White House. And even with her soft power and her unofficial role, I mean, she got a lot of hate. She really did. So for everybody that held her in the highest regard, as, many did, there was somebody else, being derogatory about her. So, I mean, one would totally understand why, for personal reasons, she wouldn't. But it would have been a balm and a tonic, I think, to an awful lot of people, especially in that that period where Biden's power was kind of unraveling, albeit softly, but it was. I think the role that she did take on over the summer of, kind of motivator and cheerleader and being there on the podium, as often as her husband was over the summer, it just showed that, she still has massive soft power and influence. And maybe in some ways it's good to keep that as it is, rather than, channeling it into the more formal route as Hillary Clinton did. And, of course, it's great that she tried, but certainly she's kind of keeping her brand less contaminated, I think, if you like, but by not running, because the minute you run, everybody's in the gutter.
Yeah.
So I really respect and understand why she wouldn't.
Yeah, of course. And let's go back to this idea of legacy here, because you touched on that already with Michelle Obama, and in terms of presidential legacy, I think it's interesting that 15 former vice presidents have been able to win the presidency, 6 of those entirely through their own merit of campaigning and winning. But do you think that there is this inheritance of your boss's legacy when you are running yourself, having been a vice president? Thinking back to that quote that you gave about the vice president being like a catatonic state, you're doing none of the decision making, but you are marred with that brush.
Yes, I mean, it must be, it's a kind of it's a help and a hindrance, I suppose, isn't it? I mean, again, you think back to, somebody like Harry Truman or whatever, who, gets promoted, if that's the right way to put it, under really quite traumatic and dramatic circumstances for the nation. I mean, you can say the same about Lyndon Johnson. In a way, it's worse for him, because, I mean, at least FDR was the father of the nation dying, which is a profound moment, but it's still, it's in keeping with the order of things, isn't it? Whereas when Kennedy dies, it's like the son of the nation is struck down so publicly and so horrifically, and he has to step in. So there are different ways where you can, I suppose, kind of utilize the hand that you're dealt. I mean, Truman, he seemed so small after FDR, the little man from Missouri or whatever. It's like how to fill and grow into that space. And I mean, arguably he did. And, history now looks at him really with more than respect. He's held in extremely high esteem. With Johnson, I think he was pretty adept in the sense that, arguably he was perhaps a little bit more socially to the left than Kennedy was. So, coming in and with all the kind of the civil rights progress that was bubbling along in the early 60s, and he gets to say, oh, but we must do this. It's what President Kennedy would have wanted. And there's, very strong kind of a moral push with that. So it depends a bit. I mean, if you're George Bush Senior coming in after 8 years of Reagan, I mean, again, going back to what I said earlier about, Reagan being the shining star, it's hard to hold up if you're not such a radiant character yourself as Bush Senior wasn't. Then it's really quite difficult, and it must be frustrating when everyone like pundits and journalists and the like keep referring to you as Reagan's third term. You're only there because we couldn't have Reagan back again. That must be annoying, because you're bringing your own skills and talents to the job. So I think it does depend. I mean, we've seen this with Harris, I suppose, particularly maybe in this campaign that's just happened, because she had that extremely difficult tightrope to walk, in that, she was in that position because of Joe Biden. For A, he chose her as his vice president. B, he agreed to step down. She steps out, we all know that story. And then afterwards, she is criticized because she didn't distance herself enough from him and, sort of step away from his presidential agenda. So, is it because she was too loyal that she didn't do better in the election? That's for another day. But just the likes of James Carville and others saying, oh, she should have just cut loose instantly. That's what politics is about. It's about winning, personal loyalty and being kind and like that gets you nowhere. And I mean, I'm literally listening to James Carville saying this recently and thinking, okay, perhaps he's correct because she lost. But on the other hand, I mean, you have to surely have some integrity and loyalty and respect for the person who put you in your position of power in the first place. So I don't quite know what the answer to all that is, but it's tricky taking the mantle from somebody else for sure.
Definitely. I mean, everyone loves compassion and loyalty in politics until you lose an election, right? But I think there is a double-edged sword, though, to it, isn't there? Because if the president that you've been veeped to was really popular like Reagan, the bar is so high, it's almost impossible to live up to those expectations, as George Bush found, because he lost his re-election bid. But then if you were the vice president to say Biden, who had quite a low approval rating and was considered not a particularly highly successful president, certainly right now, you're kind of then having to fight immediately against this wave of criticism because you were part of that administration. So it's really challenging as a vice president who does want to then move up into the presidency, because you've either got to live up to high expectations or you've got to fight against the low expectations created by your boss.
Yeah, absolutely. And you have, I mean, obviously, I mean, I suppose every situation is slightly unique in that, it's different individuals and all the rest of it. But I mean, the one that springs to mind again is, after 8 years of Bill Clinton and Al Gore is running for office. And I mean, Gore was so accomplished and, had a CV that was, phenomenally impressive and all the rest of it. But by the end of the Clinton second term, the Clinton brand was pretty contaminated. So Gore is in that really tricky position of, well, he wouldn't have been where he was had it not been for his friend Bill Clinton. And yet even having Clinton on the campaign trail with them at that point was problematic because, of all the scandals and all the rest of it associated with Clinton. So Gore is trying to kind of, present himself as other. And then he has the problem on, like with the debates and all that, where, he's presenting what his brief would be, etc. And of course, his opponents can say, you were there for 8 years. Why didn't you do this already? So you're always going to have that argument pushed back on you.
And also, you've got to think, since, I don't know, for most of the last 100 years, the only example I can think of a vice president successfully winning election after 8 years of a president from the same party is George Bush Sr. Americans typically get very itchy feet after 8 years of one party, and it's incredibly difficult for the same party to then put another candidate in and win the presidency.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it is a pendulum, I think, for sure. And as you say, it's not even necessarily about which party it is. It's just the fact that 8 years of anything is a very long time. And people do tend to be bursting for the other. You see it in other countries as well. You see it in the UK and elsewhere. It's not unusual in any way. But I suppose it must be frustrating then for that individual who's going, okay, I have 8 years insider experience, I know the mechanics and the dynamics, I know, blah, blah, blah. I know how to sort of move on from what's come before. all of this kind of thing, and yet they don't always get the opportunity to do it. I think in some ways, I mean, if we were to think of the kind of the converse of that, then maybe the best way to go about it is to be, you know, a Dick Cheney kind of a person and go, well, I'm not running, you know, for, I don't know what it was his health or his heart or whatever he said, or maybe he just didn't want to, didn't feel the need to. But he's in there. He's arguably the most powerful vice president ever, I would say, in terms of what he did and how he perceived the role. And he's liberated from any sort of constraints in terms of, oh, well, I better toe the line or look a bit deferential or whatever if I want to carry on the mantle. He just said no, and that's fine. So, I mean, in a way, that might be a way to go.
Yeah, it's a great example. And I guess sort of following on from that, just to sort of wrap up everything we've spoken about, how much control do you think the vice president really has ultimately in shaping an administration and a presidency?
I think perhaps where their influence and kind of consequence can be felt, going back to the idea of the kind of the softer side of it, it depends a bit on the rapport between the president and their Veep. You know, there have been some, you know, you wouldn't necessarily put, I don't know, Walter Mondale up as the most, you know, he wasn't Dick Cheney, let's put it that way. But on the other hand, you know, Mondale and Carter, they have this, what seems to me like an unprecedented relationship as president and vice president, because it is transformed from, you know, the boss and the person in the other room to actual genuine friends with a genuine sense of kind of parity. You know, having the regular meetings, Mondale is in the room at all times. Carter takes, you know, a phenomenally long time to make sure that he's choosing the right person, all of this kind of thing. So it's like the role is taken seriously. And I don't mean that from that point on, it's just gotten stronger. That would be far too simplistic. But that Mondale-esque way of being the vice president can actually be very influential, because it means you are in the room, you are being listened to. And you know, that thing of, you know, being the last person in the room with the president when everybody else is left, that's the kind of power that the Veep can have. So whilst it might not be so kind of exciting and as kind of glamorous as some of the other roles, it can, depending on the rapport, I think really actually be quite influential.
Yeah, well, it's an interesting discussion, and I think the Veep generally doesn't get the attention and the focus maybe it deserves. So hopefully we've been able to do our little bit for that in this podcast. So that about wraps up this episode. Thank you so much to my guest, Clodagh Harrington, for joining me. And if you want to find out more, because you love listening to this, we're going to put some useful links in the show notes. So check those out as well. Clodagh, if anyone wants to connect with you, where can they do that?
Yeah, I'm still on Twitter /X for now anyway. So I am Dr_Clodagh on there. So yeah, be delighted if anybody wants to give me a follow. I'll follow them back. I'm on LinkedIn as well. I'm still actually getting my head around LinkedIn, but yeah, I do use X quite a lot for work purposes.
Awesome. Yeah, and you can find me as well on X. I'm still there, and on Blue Sky, because I love jumping on a bandwagon, and LinkedIn as well. Just search for my name and you should find me. And if you enjoy listening to this podcast, please leave us a rating and a review wherever you are listening to this, and give us a follow as well, so that all future episodes appear in your feed. And also, if you follow the links in the show notes, you can support the show from as little as £1. But if you pledge a little bit more, you also get early access to some of the bonus content, such as the one we're going to record straight after this. So thank you so much for listening, and goodbye. Thanks so much for listening to the podcast. And if you enjoy this and want more, remember you can support the show from as little as £1. All the details are in the show notes.